give me a true statement. That was a tough assignment, wasn't it? Right. Here's the problem that I have with that. Is that really right? Is it really the case that the only kinds of true or false statements have to be of one of the forms A, E, I, or O? So all, I should actually turn that on automatically without even thinking about it. So all of the subject is predicate. So the A form, right? Everything in this set is also in this set. So if I diagrammed it, we could say this is S is P, right? So everything in the set that's S is also in the set of things that are P. And this kind of statement then would be anything where I'm talking about like the genus, the family, any of those hierarchical kinds of orders that we think of. So all animals are life, and all life is precious, or well, whatever you want to say. And then even further down, any kinds of horses. All the horses are inside of animals, and inside of horses, all baby horses are, of course, horses, and so on. So you can imagine how categorical reasoning, what Aristotle is giving us, is essentially going to be a matter of identifying which sets of things are included in what other sets of things. And then the other type, called the E statement, right? No S is P, so they're mutually excluded. So cats and dogs are excluded. No cats or dogs. No pies or cakes. That could be borderline. Is Bavarian cream pie a pie or a cake? That's pretty darn close to cake, isn't it? But you get the idea, right? So we can fight over what thing, how the categories should be set up and so on. But what's interesting to me is that besides this, and we have some S is P, some S is not P, right? So when we get into that, these are the only kinds of statements that could be true or false. So remember, imperatives communicate, but at the same time cannot be determined to be true or false. It doesn't even make sense. It's puzzling. Why would you even think about that, right? The same thing with questions are obviously neither true nor false, right? Exclamatories, yippee, oh shit, those are neither true nor false, right? Even though we might imagine a situation where you were right to say that, as you're falling off the cliff and you go, oh shit, it might even be considered true, in that context. But strictly speaking, what we're saying is, following Aristotle, that these statements are true or false depending on whether they correspond to the actual arrangement of things that they're describing. So all toasters are mechanical devices, right? That seems true. It gets a little bit tricky when we're talking about personal names. So for example, all Hillarys are ex-secretaries of state. Well, no, that's false, because there's multiple Hillarys, right? Hillary Putnam, not an ex-secretary of state, right? But Hillary Clinton is an ex-secretary of state. That's a true statement, and we would say that it's an A statement because Hillary Clinton is all of the members of the subject set Hillary Clinton, even though there's, of course, multiple ex-secretaries of state and so on. We also recognize that in this form of statement, this term is considered distributed, but this term is considered undistributed. And what does that mean? Well, for anything in the statement that I'm saying all of the S are also P, or all the subject are also predicate, I know something, if it's true, about all of the members of the subject set. They are all distributed into this predicate set. But the problem with this set is that if I say all horses are animals, that doesn't tell me something about all animals. I know that all horses are in this set, but I don't know something that's true about all animals. I know some of them are horses. Right? So we refer to this term as undistributed in this statement type. Yes, that is really that significant. Now on this one, what's interesting is both of them tend to be thought of as distributed, because I know all of these are over here and all of these over here, so I know that none of these are these, and none of these are these. The neat thing about that is if I say something like, no dogs or cats, I can actually just turn that right around, the converse, say no cats or dogs. No dogs or cats, no cats or dogs. They are logically equivalent. So I can just do that. Now with this one, notice, if I say all horses are animals, I couldn't use the converse and say all animals are horses, because that's false, right? So that's interesting. In this statement, though, we say that both terms are undistributed, because if I just know some of these are those, and so also some of these are these. That's interesting. Notice it's equivalent both ways. So if both terms are distributed, you can use the converse and their equivalent, but if both terms are undistributed, you can use the converse and they are equivalent. Oddly though, at least it feels odd to me, in this case we say that the subject set is undistributed, but that the predicate set is distributed, and that's always struck me as weird. But the reasoning for it is that these particular members of the predicate set are not members of the set. So we know something about all of that limited number of, actually none of these are that particular set that are not these. Somehow that works. So that we end up then with this interesting logical pattern that in this statement type we're saying distributed, undistributed, distributed, distributed, undistributed, 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 distributed. So all four logical possible relationships between two terms are there. Okay. Now here's an interesting problem though. What if you cannot actually check to see if the corresponding sets are related the way that you say? So for example, if I say all blondes are morally corrupt. Are you a blonde? No, well, I'm sorry, let me change it. All redheads are witches. German tradition, especially if they have green eyes. You gotta make sure. Be careful. But you get the idea. So all redheads are witches or evil women, right? You think you could scientifically verify that?
Which part of the evil part?
Especially with hair dye, it becomes really a problem. But the thing is, you know, there are those that think, oh, she's a witch, and others are absolutely attracted. You know, and it might even, you know, Salem, I think that's part of the problem there was, wow, the reason we think she's a witch is because of how attracted you are. She's obviously got a power over you. Oh, she's a wonderful person. No, she's a witch. We're going to kill her. No, well, weigh her against a duck. See if she floats. Sorry, it's the money. Right? Yes, it's a mental illness. I know. I'm assuming everyone has been totally destroyed by the Monty Python and all of its.
We can only hope.
Well, so here's the issue for this, and Aristotle doesn't give us this. This is actually a modern interpretation of this. So I'm conflating both Aristotle and contemporary concerns, and this is also referred to as the Bouguereau theory. Statements that are valuative, morally valuative statements, are non-cognitive, which means they can't be basically understood in a scientific sense because they can't be evaluated. So you cannot check to see if they correspond to reality. And so rather than saying they're false, because we don't know that they're false, and neither do we know that they're true, we can't define whether they're true or false. So therefore, valuative statements, even though they're of this form, are neither true nor false. So you end up with some statements that fit these templates, but are in modern jargon. How modern? Since roughly 1770, that's when that really started. David Hume is the one that and we refer to this as the natural fallacy, the naturalistic fallacy, and there's other variations of that too. Nothing so as easy as I would like it to be, but 1 + 1 = 2. Whew, thank goodness for that. Although I do get puzzled over 1 heaping teaspoon plus 1 heaping teaspoon, because that might be more than 2 teaspoons. So I can imagine some difficulties, even something so blatantly obvious. But so the problem then is, if I make a moral statement, I end up having a problem with it, even if it's in one of these forms. And of course, typically, much of the things we say, this would be really boring if we spoke this way. And so we make our statements much more complex, typically. So how would Aristotle have evaluated them? Well, you would have to break them down into one or more of these statements. So if I say all roses are red and prickly, right, for Valentine's Day or something. Obviously that's false because there's a lot of roses that are not red. And I think you could also grow thornless roses, actually, right? Yes?
But doesn't it need to be a true statement to fit in one of those categories?
No. If it's either true or false, it would have to be one of these types. So yippee isn't true or false, but all cows are horses. It fits this statement type, but that's totally false, right? Because we can go and look and we check every single cow and determine that that's not a horse, right? So that would be false. Who would say that? That's just dumb. That's false. So that's on the other hand, all cows are 4-footed animals. And I know you could find one that's got a missing. We'll call it a hoof, right? I don't know what they call a cow. Hawk, right? Is it a hoof?
Yeah, so.
Okay. So I don't know, but you get the idea, right? So I could have compound statements, and in order to figure it out, I would have to break it down mentally into one or more of these statements. So if I had all pregnant mares, that's not going to work. I'll just a really boring one, the sky is gray and cloudy, assuming it's like this afternoon, right? So the sky is gray. So anything that is the sky is in the set of things that's gray. And then anything that's the set of things that's the sky is also in the set of things that's cloudy, right? So by saying the sky is gray and cloudy, I'm not just saying one case statement, I'm saying two case statements. My grammar has enabled me to compress them together. Now we do have some statements that are problematic in this regard, and they're referred to as relational predicates. So for example, John lent Mary a book, right? How does that fit Aristotle's arrangement here? The cheap way out of it is to say, whatever the person's name, John lent Mary a book, whatever I said. Right? So John, for anything that's John, is in the set of things that lent Mary a book. So I can get out of it that way, that's pretty cheap. But obviously it also indicates, that, well, what if he lent Jane a book? Okay, well, that's still false. But I had to check something else. What was the person that he lent the book to, right? It could be Mary, but it could have been someone else, right? So he is the one that lent the book, but I got the wrong person that he lent it to. So it's false, but it feels like you have to investigate further than just this. So this is an interesting system. And remember I showed you the square of opposition, I think, right? Yes, you remember? You were, okay. I can just do it this way too. So I actually have them all up here. Let me get these diagrams out of the way. It's not really even how we diagram them today. We use diagrams that are not designed by Aristotle. They were created by John Venn, V-E-N-N, who was a Harvard mathematician. Far back enough that the stained glass windows in the Harvard chapel are all Venn diagrams. So if you ever get to visit Harvard, check out the chapel and see all the Venn diagrams on the chapel windows. But so for example, here, what we would do is overlap them like this, and say all S is P, so there are no members over here. We use these diagrams just the opposite of the way they do in statistics class. So if I have no S is P, there are no members in the overlapping section. If I have some S is P, I put an X there to indicate there's at least one that's in there. And over here, I put the X out here because there's at least one that is not in the overlapping section. So we have these little diagrams that enables us to do that. But the square of opposition points out that when I'm talking about the same two sets in all four places, so blondes, right? If S equals blondes and P equals the set of things that have more fun, right? So if it's true that all blondes have more fun, I'm not going to find any blondes out there that do not have more fun. So this is true, this is false. If on the other hand, there's a blonde and she's not having more fun, well then this must be false, right? Pretty easy. These are contradictions, contradictories. For any that have these two sets, not only blondes and have more fun, but horses and animals, right? So if there's all horses are animals, then it would have to be false that some horse is not an animal. That can't be. If on the other hand I find a horse, whoa, and it's not an animal, what the heck? That would really screw me up, right? But if I did find that, then this would have to be false, right? So they're contradictories. And notice the same relationship is here. Those are contradictories also. If there is a cat that is a dog, then that has to be false to say that no cats are dogs, right? So they're contradictory. This relationship, though, is interesting. One of the reasons I know it's odd picking on blondes, but I've heard from students that it's false that all blondes have more fun. And I understand it's also false that no blondes have more fun. It is true that some blondes have more fun, and some blondes do not have more fun. So we've got a situation where the A and the E statement and these are referred to as the contraries. They can both be false. If one is true, the other one has to be false, but they can both be false. But notice in this example of blondes and having more fun, the sub-contraries can both be true. In fact, it seems impossible for both of them to be false. One of them has to be true, right? There's also relationships this way. This is referred to as the super-altern, because it's up, and this is the sub-altern. And the relationship, at least for Aristotle, was that if this is true, then this must also be true. And the same thing over here. So the super-altern and sub-altern have not a reciprocal relationship, because if it turns out that some blondes do not have more fun, that's not grounds for thinking that, well, so no blondes have more fun. I would have to actually check all blondes and make sure that they were all mutually excluded from the set of things that are having more fun.
Isn't that where the I'm afraid the name you just said it starts with a B, the
Blondes?
No, not blondes. The not Van.
John Van with diagram?
Because if you're going from the top one to the bottom one, the top one doesn't say that any blondes actually exist. But if you go on the bottom one, you're saying there is at least
Right.
one S and one S is not.
Right, right. Okay, so this brings up the question of existence and whether or not we have members, we actually have existing members of the sets, right? And the Greeks apparently were not concerned with that possibility at all. It's got to be the case that they had names for things that didn't actually exist. They had weird gods and so on, half man, half animal kinds of creatures and so on, which never existed. But they weren't concerned about it for some reason. We become concerned with that, and it's not clear if it's because ancient Greek and modern Western European languages are different enough that it's an issue, or that we just became really weird and nitpicky about the way things are related in this. And so we end up then arguing if you look at the website that I had pulled up, which was the Stanford Encyclopedia, online Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the traditional square of opposition, and they talk about all the various contemporary issues that essentially are a conflict with the traditional system. So when we look at that, we say in English, just because all S is P doesn't guarantee the truth of some S is P, because we feel like this statement requires the existence of at least one member of S, right? So if I'm talking about something like unicorns, right? Definition of unicorns, all unicorns are single-horned animals, right? So some unicorn is a single-horned animal, but wait a minute, we feel like there's existential import There's a requirement for a member of the set to actually exist. And since in the case of unicorns, there are no existing members, it feels to us like, wow, this is true because of the definition of unicorns. This is false, because it would imply there's a real unicorn sitting somewhere, right? And so that becomes a real problem for us, right? So when you look at that page, it has several different ways of handling that. Some logic books, for example, say, well, we'll just stipulate that there's always at least one member in every set we're talking about. So we're not talking about unicorns, let's forget that as a problem, right? The other way is to say, well, you know, a lot of the times we're talking about sets that have no members, so we better just erase all of the things that won't work. So a lot of the relationships go away, and you end up only with contradictories left, really. That feels so like the guts are torn out of this system that Aristotle's either, he either created this or he's kind of collected, you know, whatever was already available to him, but we don't know where he got it. And he does actually describe the folks where he gets things from, so it seems like he's actually the first to really put this together. By the way, once he constructs this logic in the various tools, the organon that he does, the categoriae and so on, we end up then having a logic tool that he himself applies to his predecessors to point out in the book, The Sophistical Refutations, where a lot of his predecessors, even presumably Plato, has made argumentative mistakes, where they're arguing something that the argument form is invalid, as Aristotle describes it. And we would agree with him, actually. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why what we'll see as history proceeds, that Aristotle's philosophy ends up being kind of swept away for a while, for political reasons mostly, and it's away from the Western view for the most part. There are some things that remain, but for the most part, it's not part of the Western philosophical mindset until the Crusades, when scholars or monks that accompanied the various crusades engaged the mostly one particular individual, especially it seems, and that's Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, who was the advisor to Saladin, and in negotiating with them became friends, and he gave them copies of Aristotle's works that they hadn't been familiar with, and they brought them back to Europe and began looking at Aristotle once again, right? But so an awful lot of Aristotle's persuasiveness that defeats Plato doesn't amount to a hill of beans for about 1,000 years in the West, because they lost him somehow. You know, he's clearly still extant and thought about among many of the Middle East scholars. And they continue on with him. Clearly there's some other stuff of his that was lost. Burning of the library in Alexandria seems to be a really damaging event, especially when we think about all the wealth of texts that might have been there from the Egyptians, that incredibly long-lived, powerful civilization. Who knows what we lost from that kind of thing. And by the way, we're seeing the same sort of thing happening with ISIS destroying anything that they don't feel is part of a very specific, restricted interpretation of the text that they believe to be true, right? So that happened more than once, right? traditional system, we have these kinds of statements as the only kinds of statements that you can use in building your knowledge, basically. Right? The problem with valuative statements is a contemporary issue, not something we see with Aristotle, especially when we talk about the Nicomachean ethics, for example. He'll make a lot of very, what he considered blatantly obvious true statements that were value-based, that we could, of course, in a contemporary sense, critique, but were certainly acceptable as true up till, really, David, you. And in fact, a lot of people still today, of course, even in Western society, think of certain of the, so it's one of the things I like presenting in logic, or talking about Aristotle, because I think it's startling to people to realize the limit, really, of what we can say in sort of an empirical scientific sense, of what we can verify. And it's one of the reasons why interpretation is such a big issue for us, because you can interpret history, you can interpret values, right? And you can have your opinion, and you can have your opinion, and everyone can have their own opinion, and we're totally stuck. You cannot demonstrate that your opinion is any better than anyone else's, although we vote. We typically will vote on that sort of thing, but a so-called scientist can't come in and in the lab check it. Whoa, you're right. A fetus is a person. Can't actually do that. I mean, that's why we're still have these arguments. Okay, so the next step then for Aristotle is to move from one statement that can be verified as either true or false to, of course, the argument form itself. And for Aristotle, what we refer to then is what's called a syllogism, right? Where you're bringing all of these logics together. So a syllogism is essentially combining them, right? And so what can we have? We can have a very specific form of argument that will consist of a premise that Aristotle refers to as the major, and the second premise that he refers to as the minor, and then the conclusion. Now remember, all three of these statements have to be of the form A, E, I, or O, right? There's no other statement that you can make that would fit. Right? So the next step is to say in the major premise, we can have two terms. So I'll have, say, all. So all of something is something. In my minor premise, I can say all of something is something. And then in my conclusion, I can say all something is something. So how does he arrange this argument form? He says, well, the first thing you have to do is look at the conclusion and determine what is the subject set of the conclusion and what is the predicate set. And so in the argument, this will be the minor term, and this will be the major term. And so the major term has to occur in the major premise. And it could occur either here or here. The minor term has to occur in the minor premise, and it has to occur either here or here. But it could be in either place. In fact, we end up with what's referred to as the figure. So in the first figure, I could have the major term here and the minor term here. And then this term mediates between the two. So if I have information that relates this term to the major term, it's premise one, then I have the minor term related to that mediating term, then that should give me grounds for saying there's a relationship between the minor term and the major term. So the mediating term is referred to as the middle. And notice in this particular form, I'm using figure 1. In this figure, which is called figure 2, I would have these two swapped, right? In figure 3, I would have this one swapped. And in the last one, I would have both of them swapped. Right? So this particular argument form is referred to as having a name, and the name includes the mood. The mood is determined by the type of statements that I have. So in this case, they're all A statements, so A. Remember, Aristotle bores everybody to death by being so comprehensive, so nitpicky, right? You know, and it's not just with this. Notice, we'll look and you'd see he talks about the gait of animals. How does this go this way or does it go like this? Right? You know, he's got to check every. You know, he wants to solve all the problems, and by his method, it's all categorical. So all we have to do is describe everything as the kind of set it is. And guess what? You know, goats walk a certain way. All goats walk that way. You know, people all walk the same way, right? So you know, and grammar, right? You know, so the grammar of the sentence basically is all going to be part of it. So sorry about this. You know, if it's boring, it's not my fault. Right? I'm just showing you how it works as far as I understand. And I could be wrong. So remember, I'm fallible, so check my work. So the mood is A, and this particular figure is figure 1. And I always use that one because that one also has a name. I always think of Barbara Bush as one. That has nothing to do with Barbara Bush. Although, when I listen to George Bush W. give one of the State of Union addresses, and I analyzed his argument, it was argument, and each one was Barbara, all the way down. All of this form, right? So, I mean, so you could liven this up by putting specific things in. So, for example, all terrorists are evil. So I'm using the middle term as terrorists and predicate term, the major is evil, and S, Saddam. Or as George would say, Saddam. It was funny back then. I don't laugh anymore. So all terrorists are evil. Saddam Hussein is popular, proper noun, so you don't need the all because there's only one, right? Saddam Hussein is a terrorist. Therefore, Saddam Hussein is evil. Therefore, we have to blow him up, right? That thing. Right. That was his argument, basically. And you couldn't disagree with the argument unless you disagreed with the one or the other premises. So for example, some liberals pointed out you can't have war against terror. That's the way George would say, terror. Right? Remember, though, he was actually deliberately speaking Texan. Because he learned his lesson in the first election he was in, he lost to a super Texan. And so he learned his lesson, and from ever after that, he was not going to be out-Texaned again, right? So you have to pick up the slang, and you have to talk about, armadillo, so our dog went in after the armadillo, Sorry. I voted for him twice, so it's, I
heard that.
Okay. So notice, if you're going to critique this, you have to critique the premises. If the premises are accepted as true, then the conclusion absolutely follows from that. And you can diagram it this way, right? So the minor term, the middle term, major term, right? So all of the subject is middle, all the middle is predicate, so therefore all the subject is predicate. All the minor is major. Obvious, right? So notice this has a name, and by the way, the names do not come from Aristotle. The names came from the Middle Ages, where the monks gave them names that made it easy for them to remember. And it's a code, so if you look it up, it's kind of an interesting code, because so in this one, for example, here's your three premises, A, right? And the letters before, so they're not actually names, so like Caesar is not the same as Caesar, right? Caesar is one of the other valid argument forms. Right? We could do another argument form, so you could just see something else. So for example, if I change this, now I have I, figure 1, and some men are romantic. Some sweeties are men, so some sweeties are romantic. So some men are romantic. Just some sweeties are men. Sickening, isn't it? Sorry. So therefore, some sweeties are romantic. Does it sound persuasive? Because you know some sweeties who are romantic, right? Actually, it's an invalid argument. Let me diagram it like this. You can see all logical possibilities relating to these three terms. This set will be the middle term. This set will be the minor term, the subject of the conclusion. And this set will be the major term, the predicate of the conclusion, right? My first premise, some men are romantic. Romantic is a predicate term. These are sweeties. I don't smoke. So, and these are men. So some men are romantic. Is that where they are?
Goes on the line, isn't it?
It actually goes on the line. Because I don't know for sure if they're only romantic or if they're also sweeties. So the correct placement for this very ambiguous bit of information is to put it on the line. That way it indicates that I don't know if they're over here or if they're over here. Next, some sweeties are men, right? Same issue. Again, I have two different places where it could go, but put it on the line. Now my conclusion has to be actually drawn for sure for me to know that it's valid. And if I look, some of my subject set are in my predicate set. I would actually have to have an X somewhere in this area to know that this is true based on the information given in the premises. And because, especially since these are ambiguous, if either one of these actually ended up in here, then I would know for sure that's the case. But they're ambiguous. And the reason they're ambiguous is because both of these terms are undistributed. Both of these terms are undistributed. And both of these terms are undistributed. But one of the things that we learned by analyzing the arguments in general is that in order for you to have a valid argument, the middle term has to be distributed in at least one premise. In this particular case, it's not. So this is way, way invalid. This is the weakest possible syllogism you can have. So just because it's a syllogism doesn't mean that you're going to have a good argument. There's only, out of 256 possible argument forms, you can have 64 moods times 4 figures, so 256 possible arrangements, right? A, E, E, A, I, O, I, O, et cetera, right? Yeah. And figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, figure 4, for all of them, right? So I can have 256 possible syllogisms, of which, for Aristotle, only 24 were considered valid. In fact, things are a little bit more confused because he never used figure 4. You don't know why. Figure 4 was kind of dropped off his. So I'm kind of glancing into more the Middle Ages use of Aristotle's system for this demonstration. But so only 24 argument forms, and AAA1 is considered so, it's the divine argument. Barbara is the divine argument. And the code, by the way, that the medievals created enables you to move all of the valid argument forms by converse, contrapositive, or can't think of the third possibility. Contrapositive, converse, and I can't think of it. You can rearrange the premises in a way that they're still equivalent. You can rearrange them in such a way that you can bring all the arguments back to the divine argument, so they say. So this is fun. And one last thing that I wanted to bring up here. So say you're familiar with this enough, and you start couching all of your arguments in this system, which you can be trained to do, and all the little tools are meant to help you do that. The next step is to compile your arguments. So in a long dispute of some sort, where I want to get all the way down to this conclusion, right? But I have multiple conclusions on the way to get to it, right? So this is called a Sorites, or also in Greek it means the heap. So that's kind of interesting, right? So you can heap these arguments together, and so I'll have premise, premise, conclusion. Now the conclusion might be then the next premise for the next argument. So I'll have, now this becomes premise, premise, conclusion, premise, premise, conclusion, etc., right, all the way down. So that becomes a heap, or a Sorites. By the way, there's also an interesting paradox called the paradox of the heap, or Sorites, and that's the problem with the grain of sand. So if I have a grain of sand, is that a heap yet? No. 2 grains? No. 3 grains? No. 4 grains? No. 5 grains? No. When does it become a heap? We don't really know. At some point, though, we say, this is a heap of sand. Is it still a heap? Is it still a heap? We don't know. So that's kind of the Sorites paradigm. By the way, this method is still used today, although after roughly Charles Dobson, the AKA the author of Alice in Wonderland, what's his pen name? Alice in Wonderland, remember? Charles Dobson, right? Dodgson, Charles Dodgson. I can't think of his name as the Lewis Carroll. It's not his real name. Lewis Carroll writes Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass. They're all logic books, by the way. Very confusing. I think very clearly because he was also on opiates.
He also probably had a disease.
Did he? I hadn't heard that.
It's actually called Alice in Wonderland syndrome.
No kidding?
Yeah, actually they did a study on it.
What? What other symptoms are
The
there?
symptoms is on the prefrontal cortex, he has a lot of issues with, not how he's always saying things are bigger than what they seem and smaller than what they seem. They think that he actually had that problem. And that it wasn't an eyesight issue, it deals with the frontal cortex issue. Because some people seem giant to you, other things seem super small. They actually think that he had that because it has been documented, like later on, a few years after that it was documented.
Did they dig up his corpse and do any?
No, I don't think they did any of that, but they just
They do
assumed
that
since,
now.
I think they were just assuming that his writing, I mean, they even based the name of the disease based on that, you know, but they actually thought that he had that. Because, I mean, back then they didn't really, not everything was really
Right. Well, they
documented.
argue over certain philosophers they think had syphilis, like Nietzsche, for example. It was called softening of the brain. Argue that Wittgenstein was autistic. Kierkegaard, they think, had bipolar. You know, so there's all kinds of interesting. Pardon?
I said that makes sense, actually.
Yeah. Well, really great author whose name is K. Redfield Jamison. No relation to me. You know, and that's clearly not a bias that I have in favor of her because her last name is the same as mine. But she determined that she had bipolarity in college where she was studying to be a psychiatrist, made it through because of her colleagues and so on, and has written quite a few interesting books about her experiences. The something mind, shoot, I forget. The Unquiet Mind was really, really good. But she's got also Exuberance. It's one of her books, and Touched by Fire is one. And Touched by Fire is interesting because she talks about lots of people like William James, Søren Kierkegaard and other philosophers and analyzes them and says, aha, I recognize my symptoms in these people, and so it's kind of interesting. But they also dug up Beethoven, took a clump of his hair, and they identified it as having lead poisoning. So they know, they're convinced that the reason he went deaf is because of the lead, and there's other symptoms that would, having too much lead in your system would give you some of the other symptoms that he had. That's pretty interesting. And by the way, don't drink wine or alcohol from pewter cups.
I don't think they don't drink from pewter cups.
Because it leaches the lead out of the pewter, and then you're drinking the lead, and the more wine you drink, whoa. So this is, okay. So I hope I didn't bore you with this little thing, but keep in mind that he does this. There's some of the things we've kind of updated thanks to the Middle Age monks who really didn't have much else to do except play with the logic. The reason they had Aristotle's logic to use was because Boethius was considered to be the last Roman, endeavored to translate all of Aristotle's works into Latin. And he got started on the basic logic tools. And that's as far as he got before his boss decided that he was a traitor, locked him up, and then killed him. So,
His name is Boethius?
Boethius.
Boethius.
Boethius. I think we have him. No, it ends in Plotinus, so it would be in our next book. They call him the last Rome, which I think is just really dumb, because we still have a Roman Empire. In fact, the Roman Empire has a flag flying across the highway here over at St. Andrews. So, okay. So Aristotle. I don't know if I mentioned my puzzle. I have no answer for this, but aristoi means best. Telos means purpose or design for organization, right? And so Aristotelos basically means best design. And what's he known for? A philosophy that gives us the best design. So it sounds almost like a title to me instead of a name. So I'm extremely puzzled by this. But no one ever says, yes, he was really called a brat or something until he created all this, and now we've got this title for him. No, it's like he was always Aristotle, there he is, Aristotle. Right? Puzzles me to no end. And it's not just him, right? Aristophanes, Aristoi, Phanes, best show. Aristophanes wins best show for 2 years in a row, right? So that's more of the same, right? So I'm very, very puzzled by names of the great Greeks. Socrates literally means all power. I think of that as what he always wins officially in his arguments. Plato remembers a nickname where we get Plate from, or plateau, and it means broad, basically. And he was called that as a nickname because of one of three possible factors. One, he had really broad shoulders. Two, he had a real broad intellect, or he was fat. And I think probably the best argument is he had broad shoulders because he was a wrestler. Probably a good wrestler, I suppose. And it wouldn't have been that he had a broad intellect, because we hear him called Plato even as a young man, way before he would have been famous for having a broad intellect. He could have been fat, though. Something I also didn't mention with regard to Plato is that when you're reading Plato, notice the numbers that go along. So I'm looking at page 314 in this text, if you have it with you. But notice, as you look on the left and you see that there's letters A, B, C, D, E, or maybe not all the way up to E, depending on the particular page. And along with that is a number like 897, 899. You see those? Those are referred to as Stephanus numbers. And it's based on a system from a particular collection of Plato's works that was published by a man named Stephanus, and they were in 3 volumes. And basically, you get the page number in the volume, plus the A, B, C, D, or E, depending on the paragraph it was in that original collection. There's some complications in that. Not all of the works ended up making it into his collection. The letters, for example, I don't think also made it into there. Also, because there are 3 different volumes, the numbering system starts 3 different times, but there are apparently no overlaps. So, but what you do need to do is, like, if you're reading, like this particular text, if you're reading the laws and you say 893b, you can't just say 893b and everyone will know exactly where to go, because there are 3 volumes. So what you have to do is say laws 893b, and they'll know exactly where you're referring to. Right? So the Stephanus numbers. And with Aristotle, we have a different numbering system that's based on the collection by a man named Becker, B-E-K-K-E-R. But there are some problems with this system also. It is based on a particular set of volumes. As far as I know, you don't have multiple starts to the number. So the numbering system, it doesn't go by volume as far as I recall, but he didn't have certain texts as part of Aristotle's works then because they weren't known. One of them, for example, is the Constitution of Athens. It's not one of the ones included in that. On the other hand, when we're looking at Aristotle, we have another confusion, and that is Aristotle didn't write all the things that are written by Aristotle. Aristotle's team wrote a lot of the things that are written by Aristotle. And some of those team members lived longer than Aristotle, so they're still referred to as Aristotle. There's other things that are considered not written by Aristotle's team or Aristotle, but nonetheless were signed as if they were by Aristotle, because that seemed to be the way to make your work famous. But a lot of those things are considered ridiculous, clearly not Aristotle. So like astrology texts and stuff are not considered Aristotle's.
He never studied astrology?
He studied astronomy. We have astronomy texts, but we don't have the weird exotic things.
The month and all that?
Yeah, you know. Let me actually show you some of this. So really good sources, I thought, on both the Stephanus numbers and the Becker numbers were Wikipedia. I'm sure you could find better, but I especially like the way the Wikipedia outlined it. I thought it was pretty good. And I guess you've caught on that I'm kind of a non-specialist, kind of a generalist. I mostly read pop science. Lots of it, maybe, but basically, you know, I don't go and read the abstracts and then dive into the actual difficult stuff. I read the popular, you know, like Steven Pinker and Antonio Damasio, and you know, that's. But it's always worked for me. This is 211, it's not like it's 411, does that make sense?
You have to read different
My job
books.
is mostly to get you interested in philosophy, assuming you didn't even know about philosophy before the class. And then once you get interested in it, then I pass you on to the PhDs, the folks that actually do the really hard stuff. And then they can make life miserable for you, once you get, to that, so.
For more money.
Yeah, for more money. And if they turn the lights off, you get, thank you.
That logic that we just covered, that was like, I spent all last semester on that.
Right, well, the logic class will deal with, I always start with characteristics of language first, then fallacies maybe, informal arguments, and then move into the syllogism as the first formal system. And then after spending about 3 or 4 chapters of the book detailing that and trying to get people to actually use syllogisms and arguments so you get used to them and so on.
Yeah.
And we move on to a contemporary symbol system, which is really based on that. I think only makes sense if you realize that. But then once you get that, then of course you can do quantification theory and stuff of that sort, which is mathematical logic.
They were trying to actually get, the Honors College dean was actually trying to get.
John Moorcade, yeah.
Yeah, he was trying to get, logic to take the place of, math, general education, or GER. But then, I guess he slowed on it, but he was working at it.
Well, they're really, actually, one of our professors in the philosophy department, although he's retired now, is P.E. Chang, I think, out at Matsu. I don't know if you remember him. And he's in the math department, but he taught our logic course, so P.E. Chang, I think. Actually, I couldn't understand him. He had a really heavy accent. But everybody that took his course said he was absolutely great and voted him several times, I think, the University of Alaska, not just UAA, University of Alaska's best professor. So that's pretty neat. And when the students were asked why that was the case, the one student said, well, he brings donuts to every class. That's how you become the best professor, is to bring donuts.
This is a small class, that'd be pretty easy for you.
Seems like it'd be worth at least trying for.
I think once or twice. It's Friday. Maybe you can start with just a Friday class.
Word would spread before you know it.
No donuts.
Well, we'll see. Okay, so we started with the categories last time, but we didn't get very far. So notice here we're talking about grammar. Is defining grammar? I mean, gosh, if you're the parts of speech, how things are predicated of another, and so on. So when I say all horses are animals, I'm predicating animals of horses. Yeah, I remember when I was a kid and took grammar, I always thought of the noun as the subject of the sentence and the predicate as the activity that the noun was performing. And so that was a pretty rude awakening when you start looking at the way he handles it, because he refers to them as categories. So you're relating two categories, and the one category is what we would think of as the noun, and the other category we thought of as the predicate, the verb, right? But it's the set of things that are doing that. So as I'm walking across the room, I say, okay, I'm the subject of the sentence, but the predicate is all of the things that are walking across the room, right? So it's a set of things, even though it has a particular action. So you can't actually figure out how this system works, even with the grammar that, at least that I had as a kid. So it's all, all different characteristics of substance and so on. So now, this is pretty interesting though, I think, because remember, for Plato, there's the material world, which is the world, no real knowledge, right? So everything we're seeing here and everything is corrupt, changeable, and so on. You get across that divided line, and the intelligible world is mathematics, right? And the ideas, right? So those are the unchanging. That's what Plato considered knowledge, knowing the unchanging things, right? Aristotle doesn't accept that there are non-substantial things. So the concepts of like mathematics, and by the way, this is always brought up, that Plato was a mathematician, Aristotle was not. Mathematicians tend to be Platonist and like Plato. Empiricists, on the other hand, like Aristotle. And so there's an argument over the nature of numbers. Do numbers actually exist as a thing in the universe? Does triangularity exist? Right? We know what triangularity is, three-sided figureness, right? So any three-sided figure is a triangle, right? But does that exist? For Plato, that's what existed. Triangles in the real world, so-called, are corrupted, and never quite right. And it becomes even more interesting when you later on end up with hyperbolic geometry. Hyperbolic, how do you say it? Hyperbolic. So the problem with triangularity, say on the Earth, is there are no triangles, right? Because it's curved space, and so you can't ever actually have, by definition, a complete triangle. Is that right?
Well, and nothing could actually, like a triangle can't actually exist, because if you look at it small enough, like if you looked at it down to like the size of an atom, like that's not a line anymore. That's all, they're all added lines.
Well, so we can argue till the cows come home over the existence of mathematical concepts. Are they real? Are numbers real? Etc. Mathematicians tend to think that way, that yes, they are in a Platonic sense. From an Aristotelian sense, only substantive things are real. So that was his main critique of Plato, is that the goal of explaining how knowledge works based on this conceptual schema of the ideas was a facade. There is no such thing. Knowledge has to come from our awareness of sensibilia, or physical things that impact on our senses. That's where knowledge comes. I know stuff because that black chair is sitting on the other side of this table, right? That's where knowledge comes from for Aristotle. So substance is especially important because these are the things that everything is made up of. So we end up then with his categories being is Wikipedia all right? Oh, I don't want to do that. I want to go back to Wikipedia in this case. I'm sure that's not the way he looked. I don't know where they get that stuff. That's true. It's somebody's painting. Somebody imagined what he looked like. Okay, so
So I'm assuming that they're saying substance as in like finite substance, right? Not infinite substance, right?
right.
Okay.
Right. It is a category, so it's in a sense, so it's ousia, right? So, but this is when they get into the Nicene Council and they argue over the different interpretations of who Jesus was. And you have the two sides, the Athanasius side versus Arius side. Arius argues using the term homo ousios, so there's two substances, Jesus and God the Father, they're separate. With Athanasius, it's homo ousios, so one substance with the Father, which is the side that won, and Arius became banned. That's a heresy, so thou shalt not believe that, although of course it never goes away. And so there's multiple groups that continue to believe that in their interpretation of Jesus. But so you can see, and that's, by the way, homo ousios versus homo iota ousios is where we get that expression, there's not one iota of difference, as if that's a silly thing, right? There's not even one iota of difference. Why are we arguing over this? There's not even one iota of difference between the two sides, right? And so that's where that expression comes from. But so ousia, substance, right? So what kind of substance does it make up? But you can't, so I can't say, aha, this table has substance. Because it wouldn't be a table if it didn't. So it doesn't help identify what specific kind of table this is. But it's odd to me because this table doesn't exist. Right? Is that fair to say? What's the difference between the two of them? Should we take a break? Okay, let's take a break. Should I put something entertaining up for?
What about those two black holes?
Yes,
in mine?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Something entertaining.
I have one grab.
You have something specific?
No, just something from the autograph.
And there's your beautiful baby.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Really? You're eating Doritos? He's eating Doritos on my ultrasound. Do you see what I have to do? I know.
I wrote 2 or 3 of them.
Give me that.
The commercial caused the most problems of all the Super Bowl commercials. A bunch of people were complaining, saying that it humanized the fetus. I'm not kidding, that was,
They could complain about it.
I agree. I'm just saying
Insane,
that.
man.
Yeah.
Stupid.
Okay, so on the substance thing, so substance is the thing that, if it's infinite substance, it never can depend on anything, right? And that, I mean, that's according to the Greeks, right? It's for that substance can't be dependent on anything, or primary substance would be dependent on it. It would be like the foundation of what that would be if it was in.
Right. Everything that exists has to have substance.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it's all the same kind of substance, because there's Aristotle takes the side of Empedocles, and so we have earth, air, fire, and water, the 4 elements, plus, and I'm not really sure where he gets it, he adds the 5th element, which is a cute little redhead. I don't know if you've seen her. Her name is Leilu. No, sorry, that's just a movie.
I got it.
But no, the 5th element is what holds the spheres up in, you know, so he does accept the geocentric point of view. He does accept that the Earth is a sphere, no problem with that. But everything else seems to be in various spheres going around the Earth. They actually even have to argue and prove to some people that the sphere in the sky is larger than the Earth. Some think of it as kind of like a cup that sits on top of it. Even by Copernicus, we end up with an interesting argument that he has to argue with people to prove that there's more Earth than water, pointing out if there was more water that the Earth was floating on, the Earth is heavier and so it would sink, so there would be no surface. I think it was Oscar Wilde said the only sin